her to Piper. Um, and maybe if Piper and Tom could just briefly introduce yourselves first. I think Tom knows most people. Um, and then I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, Piper, you want to lead off?
Sure. My name's Jen Piper. I go by either one of those. Most people in the movement call me Piper. There's so many Jens that were born in the 70s. Uh, and I work for the American Friends Service Committee here in Colorado. I'm in the Denver office. We have programs that mostly organize people on the near to Denver Front Range. And then we have a new program we started in Morgan County on the Eastern Plains 4 years ago. Um, and yeah, I was born in Denver, grew up in Colorado, my dad and my grandpa too. So Colorado is really important to me and is my home. I started doing the work in 2003 as a volunteer, just like all of you. Kind of became my hobby and passion. I met my current and only husband through the work. He's an immigrant rights leader, one of the 5 who led the fight for driver's licenses. So we met doing the work. So also immigration, while I have a family history of that in my like great grandparents sort of realm, immigration is also personal for me as well as a professional thing. And we have a 12-year-old, which is where more and more of this gray is starting to come from. And I think that Tom actually met Omero, my husband, first at a circus assembly gathering before the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition had staff, paid staff. And then I met Tom probably, I don't know, like 2006-ish or 2007-ish. Um, so so I was really excited to get to do a presentation with such a legend as Tom. And and maybe after Tom introduces himself, everybody could just say their name and how long you've been connected to immigrant stuff since we're a small group. But I'll pass it to Tom first.
Okay, so I'm professionally retired. I taught Spanish at Colorado Mesa University for 22 years, 23 years. Since then, I did a run for county commissioner, and that was not as successful as we would have wished. But my experience with immigrant rights started, I think I'd have to say it started when I was back east in Pennsylvania and worked with War Resisters League in fighting the Central American stuff and doing protesting in that regard. I moved out here in '99, got the job at CMU, met Ricardo Perez and Karen Sherman Perez, who are the folks that run HAP, Hispanic Affairs Project down in Montrose, and was lucky enough to know Father John Kiernan, whom some of you may know, as Hispanic Affairs Project, then was called Hispanic Affairs Pastoral Project. And it had the Guadalupana sisters with a heavy religious tone to it. Social justice was their motivator. And we hosted the largest demonstration of people in the history of Grand Junction in one of the parks there. I think we had about 5,000 people protesting what we're going to be talking about the slides, SB 90. And that was, I believe, 2006, something around there. We did work with a number of organizations to improve labor rights, especially ag labor, especially the sheep herders. And we've been doing things since then, but it's been mostly recently doing Know Your Rights trainings and things like that in Grand Junction. I have not been professionally affiliated, but been doing stuff. Yeah. Ellen, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Ellen Bradley, and I live here in Grand Junction, and I joined the immigration protection team here right from the beginning. Um, my background is that I actually knew Tom during all those years. I taught French while he was teaching Spanish at CMU. But my husband and I at the same time were running a school for international students. So my background is with immigrants, but more with international students who were here at the time to brush up on their academic English so that they could go into Mesa State College, which it was Mesa State College at the time, so they could become students. So my passion has always been for international students. Later on in my career, the last 10 to 15 years of my career, my husband and I went all over the world and trained teachers who were teaching English in different countries. And I've just always been interested in international, anything that has to do with international. And when I heard that this immigration protection team was being formed, I thought this was a way that I could become involved with the many, many different issues, of course, that have come up since Trump was elected.
Okay, thank you, Yvonne.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Um, I'm Yvonne Finch. I live in Grand Junction. I originally, gosh, uh, I think my big push around being involved with the immigrant community probably started very strongly when we adopted our third child, who is was born to an undocumented mom in California. Um, and um, I guess basically I've just always been really drawn to social justice issues, and this became incredibly personal to me then. Um, I do a lot of things here in Grand Junction, and I was very interested in the IPT and started an indivisible group back in the first uh, Trump fiasco, um, along with Gina's sister, Mary, who's been incredibly helpful. And then recently, I've been doing a lot of work with Third Act, an organization that was started by Bill McKibben a couple years ago. And we have a working group here in Colorado. And one of the foci is uh, saving democracy. And one of our big focus is in that saving democracy is immigrant rights and transgender rights and the rights of people who are incredibly vulnerable right now. So that's probably all I'll say at this point. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks, Yvonne. Tom, you're purple now. It's pretty awesome. Elizabeth, you wanna go?
So my name is Elizabeth High, and I don't have very much experience advocating for immigrants, but I have an interest in it. As a child, my mom had Russian immigrant friends that she was always visiting, and they'd come over to our house, and that was a big part of growing up for me. And my grandfather also, he lived in California, and after his wife died, he ended up moving in with friends of his coworkers, a family from Peru, who adopted him as their adopted grandfather, and he lived with them until he died. And so I have much appreciation for immigrants and all they bring to this country. But I am kind of a beginner as far as learning about the laws and how to advocate and all of that.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Richard?
Did you say, Jennifer, did you call for me?
Yeah, just
Yes.
introduce yourself.
Richard Highland is my name. Like Tom, I've worked with him for probably the last 8 years with HAP, the Hispanic Affairs Project. We moved to Grand Junction in around 2013, so I'm still somewhat new to the Western Slope and to Colorado in general. We moved from Houston, where we lived for about 30 years. And while there, I got very active with a faith community which had a pretty strong social justice focus. And I also was teaching there for a time. My short career as a Latin American historian, history of Latin America, teaching at Rice University. And in that mode, I got a call from a local order of Catholic nuns in Houston. Sister Kathy is the only thing I remember. And she was desperate for help because she had a 15-year-old immigrant from Central America, turned out to be El Salvador, who had made his way and got picked up by immigration enforcement. And she needed an expert witness at the administrative hearing, which was then in progress. And this was during the Reagan era. And so I went having no idea what I was getting into. And it turned out I was became the source of information, even for the administrator, who turned everything I was saying around to serve his interests. This kid had been sent here from San Salvador, the capital, by his parents, as had many, many others from everything we picked up from the Archdiocese at the time, because he was either going to be recruited by the guerrillas or recruited by the army, one or the other. They were ransacking neighborhoods to do that. So he left. Parents urged him to go. They couldn't go with him, but they sent him out of the country. He made his way there, and it was a direct contact with his history and, of course, the history I knew of Latin America and our immigration system that I've never forgotten. So it's a firsthand contact, and I brought a lot of those memories with me to Tom as we got to work the first Trump administration in 2017, all the way up to the present. So I'm deeply concerned. I have some sense of the immigration system and how broken it is, but obviously I don't know all the details. So here I am.
Thank you for being here. Let's see, who else are we still missing?
Kristen.
Kristen.
Gosh, in a nutshell, so I'm so appreciative of being in the company of this group. Your backgrounds are so amazing. Really quickly, I am the grandchild of immigrants who were brought over to be coal miners in Walsenburg, Colorado. So, that was what the foundation of my childhood was around immigrants and labor issues. So at any rate, fast forward, most recently, my involvement has been right shortly after I retired or reset, as a friend of mine calls it, a couple of years ago. I knew that I wanted to volunteer, and I as we began to have to absorb more and more of the newcomers in Denver, I ultimately became connected to the grassroots efforts there through the various Facebook moms groups and spent a lot of time, getting clothes and furniture to people and putting them in apartments and all of that. And that pared back a bit. And then, of course, the election happened, and it took me much longer, as I say, than Jenna. She was able to regroup in a day or two, and it took me significantly longer. But when I did find out about the immigrant protection teams, I knew that that's how I could try to create impact. And that was the next part of my journey. And I'm thrilled to be a part of this group. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Like, there's so many different types of expertise and experiences, and like willingness and energy in this group. And maybe you all already knew those things about each other, but it kind of helps, I think.
Should we hear from Deb as well?
Oh yeah. Go, Deb.
Okay. Well, what drew me into IPT, I can relate to what Yvonne said. I've always been drawn and active in social justice issues, but I had during my 9 years away from Grand Junction, because I raised my kids here, I went to study Oriental medicine, went on to get a degree, become a doctor of Oriental medicine. And I was living in Albuquerque and was just embraced by many different immigrant communities. Had many friends in they were Indian nationals. They were there on student visas. My teachers were all from China. They were on visas, and they were highly educated Oriental medicine doctors and MDs. Had a very close relationship with them. Then in the Latino communities that I lived in, I can't believe the embrace, the warmth that I was invited into their community as a healer and into the Tewa Indian pueblos as a healer. And I feel I got this personal feeling and attachment to how that's so, they're always vulnerable. They're vulnerable now. And I'm concerned about them. All of those communities, all these varying different levels of citizenship, and they're all vulnerable. And I want to do what I can. That's it.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I skipped you, Deb, and thank you for sharing. We got a lot of questions from this group. I'm gonna wager that we answer like two-thirds to three-quarters of those in the time that we have. So we put together some stuff on the history of immigration policy federally and locally that I think is pretty important context leading up to this moment. And then we have like a brief thing about what is the legal pathway, or is there one, and who does it apply to? And then I think we can kind of pause after that and see what questions you all have. But in the meantime, like just raise your hand, and Jenna, maybe you could help us keep an eye on who raises their hand. Or put something in the chat, like, and stop us if we've lost you, or if you have a question. So I'm gonna share my screen. And I'm gonna go up to This is always the place where I'm like, how present or view? Yay, okay. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So we're gonna start with a little bit of immigration history overview in the United States. So for thousands of years there were original people in the United States and all of what is now called the Americas living here. Some in very densely populated civilizations and others that were more nomadic and spread out. But either way, like highly organized societies, pre-conquest, the descendants of whom many still are alive and have their own culture and are seeking, a restoration of their land to themselves. So that's early history. But then when we look at colonialism and moving forward, you really start to see a larger influx of people from Europe in the 1600s. And we see both voluntary and forced migration, as well as straight up kidnapping and enslaving of people during this period, both indigenous folks and folks from Africa, especially West Africa. And we see the forced migration of, when I say forced migration, there were groups that were forcibly displaced, who were prisoners and just put on a boat. There were people who were facing persecution, like the Quakers, which is what the values of my organization are founded on, for their religion. And then there were folks who voluntarily were coming for land, or who were sent by varying different crowns to the United States. And during that period, you really start to see a structure of power develop, where people who are that is inherited from Europe. So you see people who are landowners who are close to one of the various crowns, having the decision-making power in the colonies, not women, not sort of peasant level folks. But people do have a little bit more freedom to move up and down sort of the caste system in the United States. And then in 1776 to 1820 is sort of the founding period of the Revolutionary War and figuring out who we're going to be. There's a lot of immigration from Britain and Germany during that time period is the largest groups of folks, although there are also like Spaniards and people from France and other folks. And when we found the country, the people who are considered citizens are all white, male, and landowning still. So we don't really shift that very much with our independence. And during that period and the following periods, all the way up until 1880, each state is deciding for itself who is a citizen on top of that. So like if you're in Pennsylvania and you're not from Germany, or your ancestors are not German, you're not considered a citizen in the way that someone who has like this German ancestry is. All the different states have different rules about who is a citizen and who counts. We don't have like one single rule. There's actually a bunch of really interesting quotes from Benjamin Franklin about that. If you just Google Benjamin Franklin and citizenship, a bunch of stuff comes up.
Yeah. Could I just mention a couple things here real
Yeah.
quickly? So I've been reading, and I've been telling all my friends in GJ about this, W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction. And one of the things that he documents is real early on, there were freed black men voting in many of the colonial states up and through the 1820s. And then as the debate on slavery versus non-slavery started to crystallize, it became more difficult to allow Black men to vote. But it's interesting that we had this foundation, and one of the things that he emphasizes is many people argued saying, we have these founding fathers that had these principles of universal suffrage, and Jen's right, we're not talking about women, of course, but these universal suffrage, and because slavery was still present, it was stopping the United States from blooming into its fullness. And then, of course, we should all remember, you alluded to this too, of course, that we took over a third of Mexico and incorporated it. And so that definitely changed the complexion of our southwestern United States in the 1820s and 1880s. And of course, none of that could happen completely until we got the Utes and the other indigenous peoples moved out so we could bring in cattle and do all the mining and all the things that the industrial area that we're getting to now is coming in. So I'll hand the mic back to Jen.
Yeah, so this concept of who whiteness being close to power is one that continues throughout all of the following kind of groups that we're going to talk about. So as Tom was referencing, sort of the takeover of Mexico, like during that time period, the time period right after that, a lot of for a large period of time, people from Mexico were considered white in the census, and then had access to vote. And then, but then in other parts of the country, that wasn't true. And then there was a backlash, and then people were excluded from their access to voting. And that's sort of what I want you to take away from this is who we allow to access citizenship and who we define as white really play into the politics of immigration and identity and power. So when we get into the 1880s, we start to see larger groups of folks coming from Ireland, from China, from Eastern Europe, and from Italy. All of those folks are highly suspect to the power structure. And a way to keep them marginalized is to distance them from whiteness. So when you look at the political cartoons of the time, a lot of Irish and Italian folks have very simian features, like monkeys, in the political cartoons. And the ruling class is really using this fear, stoking this xenophobia of Catholics, of non-English speakers, of people who are uneducated and whose loyalty is suspect, as a way to keep those immigrants in like a second class labor and voting class. And the reason for that is because slavery is also ended. So the economic engine of our country has always really relied on a second class of workers or a slavery class of workers in order to like keep the growth going. And I think those of you who mentioned growing up working class, like that's a big part of my identity as well. And I think, it's pretty obvious that having people who can't access citizenship, who are more vulnerable, is a way for kind of the economic engine to cheat, right? And to keep being super hot for people at the very top of the capitalist structure. So anyway, in 1924, we actually passed, in 1880, we passed the first exclusionary law. We say that we don't want to accept people from China, and that people who are Chinese or of Chinese descent cannot become US citizens. They can never naturalize. And that law actually lasts until 1964. So almost 100 years of Chinese exclusion. And it wasn't only Chinese folks, but also Southeast Asian folks. And then in 1924, we pass our next law, which sets a quota for immigration based on 1880 percentages. So if you're Irish, Italian, Russian, or continuing Southeast Asian folks, the percentage of people we allow in is based on the percentage of that population in 1880, which is almost nothing. So if your ancestors come after 1924 and before 1965, they probably came in undocumented because they weren't allowed to enter through inspection at Ellis Island or Angel Island. They were turned away. And that's actually where the slur WAP comes from. It stands for without papers. That was used against Italians during this period. And also interestingly, a lot of those folks were, not allowed or not really considered white during all of that period. Also, we have the 2 world wars, and during those times, we also create really strict restrictions on allowing people who are Jewish and from Eastern Europe to enter the country. And we actually turn away a bunch of flotillas full of people during the Second World War who were trying to flee to the US from continental Europe and return them to Europe, some of which are sunk then by German submarines, German warships. And those policies don't lift until after World War II is over. And then in 1964, we finally get a positive, inclusive law on immigration that undoes these earlier quota systems, lifts the Chinese Exclusion Act, allows for greater migration from countries of where people are majority folks of color. One of the big drivers of that is Ted Kennedy, in part because many of his family members couldn't get on a path to citizenship, couldn't get a tourist visa, any visa to come to the United States, right? And so these Irish Catholic guys who finally get into power are a big driving force for opening. And actually this leads to a lot of the diversity that we see in the United States today. A lot of the changing of the face of America is because of this, opening up of a process that is a slightly more, that has a little bit more of a focus for family reunification, but it does establish a quota system based on sort of different areas of the world that stands today. And we're going to talk about how that impacts migration depending on where you're from, the legal way path, how it makes it different for different people. But it's a really significant opening of the door for a lot of countries. Yeah.
We should mention the passage of the Civil Rights Act too in 64, which protects people that cannot be discriminated against based on ethnicity, language, culture, etc. So
yeah, and I'll send to you all a PDF of like all the civil rights and immigration laws that over the course of our history, because we have like an entire hour and a half module on that, but we're not going to do that tonight because they're so interwoven. And I really appreciate Tom bringing that up. Like these efforts to protect the civil rights of everyone in the United States coincide with periods in time where we are seeing immigrants as humans and recognizing them as a part of the fabric of our country, right? And then periods of great backlash to inclusion, like the one we're living in now, will also see big restrictions and punishment for immigrants. So you also have like the so-called amnesty of 1986. But after that, what we really see all the way, I'm just going to skip over these last two, but what we see from 1986, which is 40 years ago, to now are only exclusionary punishing laws passed by both parties at the federal level over many, many decades. So the system becomes, from 64 to now, becomes increasingly complex and Byzantine with every passing year. The only law group of code in the United States that is more complex than immigration law is tax law. You could have everything the same in your case except for be 1 day earlier or later than the person next to you and have completely different outcomes in your case based on that. So it's very, very, very deeply complex, and then compounded by differing levels of discretion in different types of cases, depending on the judge you see that day and what he ate for breakfast. So it's a really, really complex system. And the takeaway here is, like, our immigration and citizenship policies have never been race or class neutral. They've always been focused on racial or ethnic exclusion for the benefit of a select few. And so it's really important to keep that in mind when you're hearing about an immigration policy and being like, how is that even true? How does that even make sense? It's not about making sense. It's about power. Our immigration policies are set by power, really, and by who we're including or excluding on any given day for the benefit of power and people at the top. So
we should mention the arbitrariness of the interview process.
yeah,
For
will you bring
citizenship.
that up in when we talk about the legal way?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. So really quickly, 86, everyone thinks of this as an amnesty, but it also increased border enforcement, and it punished workers. So it makes working without status illegal for the first time ever. And in the code, there's all these penalties for employers, but I think Tom can talk about what it looks like on the agricultural side, but what we see on, say, meat packing or big corporations is that when the Immigration and Customs Enforcement does a workplace raid, they're not fining the employer at very high rates. These big corporations might pay a few $1,000s in a fine, while the individual worker is placed into a deportation proceeding that would cost them anywhere from $15,000 to $40,000 to fight on working class or agricultural wages to pay an attorney. So the punishment here is really on the worker. And that requiring I-9s, making it impossible to work above board and be protected, therefore, by all of our labor rights, has created a deeper second class or invisible class of workers. And this idea of being able to close the border or prevent migration starts to become like a prevailing idea. So while, it was estimated there were about 3 million people who were undocumented, about 1.5 million people who were able to qualify actually got through the process to become a resident. So only half of them were able to navigate that process. So that's 86. Then in 90, we see this H-1B visa program get established, and something called the diversity lottery that we'll talk about in the legal way. Then in 96, under Clinton, we see IRA pass, and also another, it's the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act. This really creates like a deportation machine, and for the first time ever sets up a heavily resourced border patrol, and a way to verify the employment credentials. It also takes everything that we do in the drug war and applies it to immigrants. So any type of interaction with the criminal legal system is now making it almost impossible for you to keep your status or adjust your status from being undocumented. And also not on here is in 94, we passed NAFTA. And that North American Free Trade Agreement really decimates the small corn farmers in Mexico and creates a big out-migration. And the federal government knew that was going to happen. So we also start putting up the first border walls in 94 and channeling people into the hottest parts of the desert where we knew people would die. And the analysis at the time was if we made it hard enough for people, they wouldn't come. And I think that's based on a really middle class idea about what's hard, right? And also what you're fleeing from. And that idea also still prevails to this day, that we can somehow deter people from migrating to the United States by making it as dehumanizing and deadly as possible, despite all the evidence that it doesn't work. 40 years later, you'll still hear both Democrats and Republicans parrot these talking points about making it possible to prevent migration through these deadly and inhumane policies. When really we could just spend all that money on, supporting things that help people stay in the place they would like to stay. Okay, so that then from 2002 forward, we see this shift on a focus of a global war on quote unquote terror, a lot of eating away at sort of the balance of power between the presidency, the executive, and Congress. A lot of power and decisions being placed directly into the hands of the Department of Homeland Security. Both parties and both chambers giving unprecedented amounts of money to the Department of Homeland Security.
Which was created under Bush and the war on terror. It didn't exist before.
And consolidates like all of the agents, all the federal law enforcement agencies under one department, and really eats away at like our ability to have privacy. But it gives the Secretary of Homeland Security operational control over all of our borders. So this is where Border Patrol starts to, in theory, have sort of basically the suspension of constitutional rules within 100 miles of the border, which is a huge percentage of the United States population, because we're not just talking about the southern border, it's also all the oceans and the Canadian border. So when you go up, when you make our big population centers are all along that. And then right after that, basically Congress stops making laws on immigration. And so instead, the executive starts making a lot of the policy for, either slightly softer, like the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, temporary status created by President Obama, or more harsh, like Trump under the Muslim travel ban, and and saying that if people access any type of benefits that they, even ones they qualify, that they might be denied adjustment of status for not being able to sustain themselves in the United States. Elizabeth.
What do you mean by suspension of constitutional rules within 100 miles of the border?
So what that means in practice is that the Border Patrol doesn't really, they set up checkpoints. They do basically profiling of people in order to target them for additional questioning or for detention. They don't have to have like a probable cause that you are undocumented in the United States. There's a lot of legal debate around whether that's actually they have that authority. But in practice, they have it. I mean, we have members whose cars have been stopped and searched, people who've been detained and then deported. They can, if they determine, for example, that they think you haven't been in the US for more than a couple of days, they could just kick you into Mexico without, any access to a judge. Yeah, I don't know, Tom, if you would add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, so it's just the opposite of what we've been talking about in the Know Your Rights trainings, where if they present an administrative warrant, it doesn't qualify for them to come into your house, etc. This border area enforcement is part of what, the war on terror. It's that
That's the
they're
job.
not following the rules that the Constitution requires in other areas.
And we saw this really become an issue in communities that hadn't been before under the first Trump administration, and now seeing it again in the second administration, where Border Patrol answers directly to the president through the Secretary of Homeland Security. They don't have any oversight from Congress. They're not responsible to like another law enforcement agency. And so they were deployed against Black Lives Matter protests in Detroit, and in Seattle, in Oregon in the first Trump administration. And they heavily targeted people of color at those rallies, and held people incommunicado for like 48 to 72 hours before releasing people who could prove they were citizens, and then turning other people over to ICE. And then we see this on like buses and trains. So when you see on the news right now that that Border Patrol is boarding Amtrak to ask people for their papers, you'll notice that they're doing that all within that 100-mile buffer of the border currently. Who knows if they'll try to expand that later, but currently that's pretty unprecedented for them to be on trains. And I was kind of surprised that Greyhound came out to say they wouldn't allow them to board, because under the first Trump administration they did. But I think it really impacted their business. And so this time around, they're saying they're not going to allow that to happen. Okay, so then, but it's not just all Trump, right? Like, both President Obama and Biden expanded the use of private for-profit detention centers. Actually, family detention began under President Obama with Secretary Clinton, and they argued that if they made it hard enough on people by detaining families in carceral settings, that people would stop coming from Central America. Sound familiar? So that was the predecessor to Trump doing family separation. It's the same logic, though. If you take the logic of this big narrative of deterrence and you look at its through line, Democrats have bought into it as heavily as Republicans have. And it's really important when we're talking with our friends and neighbors that we explain that that deterrence system doesn't work. And that it's better to have a system that is efficient and humane and transparent, that people can access in order to come here, and to invest in programs in their countries that allow them to stay where they're at, and to stop sacking their resources as the United States. So yeah, but all of this detention and surveillance expansion also happened under Obama and Biden as well. And then, most recently, Congress has taken up this bill, the Lincoln-Riley Act, that actually passed and is now law. And it takes what happened under Clinton in the 90s, where we said, if you have these certain charges, you can't adjust your status, or you're stuck in mandatory detention, you can't ask for bond, and just doubles down on it. So now instead of it just being certain convictions, it's also based on if you're charged at all with certain crimes, then you cannot access an immigration bond hearing, and you're stuck in immigration detention while you fight your case. And a lot of what they're using right now are sort of like gang association charges. Or, for example, if you don't register with the government as an undocumented person, if they now catch you, they can charge you with a crime for not registering. And we've seen that happen in Texas and Arizona. And then those folks can't qualify for a bond hearing because they didn't register with this. So it's these impossible choices. Every year over the last 40 years, the federal government has made it so immigrants have more places where there's no best choice, where if you did a logic chain of like pros and cons, there's no choice where the pros outweigh the cons, no matter what you do. If you register, you might be placed on a list for detention and deportation. If you don't register, and you get caught, then you might be charged with a crime and not be able to bond out. What is the right choice there? There's not one. You're trapped either way, you're caught either way. So the federal piece of it is pretty bleak has been pretty bleak under both parties in terms of passing any law since 1986 that allows people to get on a path to status or allows people to more easily come to the United States. All of that ended in 86. That was the last time we expanded a path for anyone. We have had some success keeping the budget from growing. We actually got the detention budget down to around 20,000 beds a day under the last years of Obama and the first years of Trump, the first time. But now it's proposed to go back up to about 50,000. It's at 46,000 beds a day right now. So there's just this really big machinery out there. But in Colorado, things look a little bit different. So now we have a choose your own adventure. We can go to talking about, does the legal way exist and for whom? Or we could talk about Colorado policy and history really quick.
I opt for Colorado.
What do you guys think? Okay. I will answer this question really briefly, and I'll send you guys a handout too. The legal pathways into the US, like to get into the US, depend on you either having already a citizen or permanent resident family member. And depending on where you're from, that could take a year or 20 years for your immediate family for that visa to be approved. If you're from the Philippines, the wait is like 25 years to an approval, and that's because of those quotas. If you're from France, it might happen in a year. And then it also depends on like how many visas are available. So then that quota system carries over into employment visas. There's only so many we give out a year. So for agricultural visas, that's 65,000 visas a year for the entire country. That doesn't even cover the agricultural workers in the state of Colorado. So it's a system that it has a cap, and we reach that cap really quickly. Once the cap is reached, there's no more visas left for you as an employer to bring someone to work for you on the agricultural side. And then on the professional side, there are similar kind of barriers and limitations. So it's not, oh, I need somebody to work for me. I could just apply for them for a visa. And then refugees is also a very complicated international process that they really are the most vetted immigrants that come to the United States. but it requires you being classified as a refugee by the United Nations and then waiting a lot of times in a camp for a lot of years. So it takes a very long time. And then if you're in the US and you're undocumented, for most people, the only way to change that is if you're actually in deportation proceedings and a judge decides to give you what's called cancellation of removal. But otherwise, the other processes are very difficult and really hard. Like marrying a citizen is not automatically grant you anything. It could take you usually have to leave your country, this country, and go to your country of origin for an interview. And if they say no, you're stuck outside the country. And there's no, it's a consulate employee who makes that decision. So the legal way exists, and it exists mostly for folks who have resources and who
But
are
I mentioned,
European
Jen, let me
countries, you know?
mention something
Yeah.
about ag workers. The amount of the percentage of agricultural workers are coming in on mostly H-2A visas, which are temporary visas. Those numbers have increased from around 100,000 in 2000. We're up to nearly 300,000 this year. But again, it's a very temporary thing, and it has to be vetted by the employer. You only can work with one employer. It's a very there's a lot of inequities because you don't have any leverage. There was the example of Star Farms up in Morgan, I think Fort Morgan. They were penalized $12,000, even though it's a multi-million-dollar operation, selling veggies to Kroger, but not paying their workers, not providing them with water, not providing them with bathrooms. So that system is really problematic, and the inspections and oversight have decreased from around 2,000 inspectors as of 2014, it was around 800 inspectors. So oversights of labor in general in the United States is not in a good way.
Yeah. So I'll send you guys this handout that covers a lot of what Tom was just talking about. Okay, so Colorado. We are like ahead of the curve, you guys, because what the federal government is trying to do to the rest of the country right now is actually what Colorado already lived through and decided we didn't like. Is the short version of this presentation. No, in all seriousness, so in Colorado, I want to start with going back to the North American Free Trade Agreement. The big influx of people, like really comparable to the influx of Venezuelans and Nicaraguans that our state saw the last 3 years, came from Mexico in the 90s. And like growing up in Denver, I'll tell you, in like 90 to 94, Denver was a bombed out, empty shell of a city. Like there was one coffee shop and a billiards place, you know, open, and like a few restaurants on Larimer Square. And that was like it, you know, for what you could do in Denver. All of the white people had moved out of the city center. There was, you know, a lot of the housing was abandoned. So in the 90s, you see the late part of the 90s, you see lots of people from Mexico coming to Colorado. A lot of them had loved ones here who had immigrated earlier. Some of them didn't, but they came to Colorado that in large part was not in like great economic shape. So there was cheap housing. And then there was also starting to be some jobs, like some increase in a little bit of needing working class folks and agricultural folks in Colorado. So in this context, there are almost no immigrant rights groups in the whole state of Colorado. In like 2000, the entire Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, which had no paid staff, was like 8 groups in the whole state working with immigrants. So it was a very small number of groups trying to meet a very large and burgeoning need. And in the backlash, you see the same types of headlines in the 90s and the early 2000s that you saw now about Venezuelans. Like, oh, you know, the crime rate is going to go up and the schools are overwhelmed and like the sky is falling and like our society is going to fall apart. And English only movements in Colorado. There was a very strong white supremacist movement in Colorado in the 90s and 2000s. You had like armed militia used to show up and counter protest Centro Humanitarios Day Labor Program. Some of the earliest protests I went to were counter protested by these guys with open carry weapons everywhere. And the state capitals started to feel a lot of pressure to do stuff about this. So in 2006, while like 150,000 people are marching in Denver's largest march at that point in history, and you have on the western slope this like, oh no, that's a few years later, but people really mobilized to say, we want immigration reform. Please don't pass this terrible law at the federal level, which is very similar to Lincoln Riley and a couple of other pieces that are now passing. We had a democratically controlled Senate and House and a Republican governor call a special session to tackle immigration. And they passed almost 24 anti-immigrant laws in this special session. Andrew Romanoff stood on the Capitol steps with the governor and bragged about having the toughest anti-immigrant laws in the country. It was us in Georgia. Arizona, Texas, Florida, their terrible laws are based on the laws that we passed in 2006. And one of the laws that we passed was this law called SB 90 that required local law enforcement to cooperate with anything ICE asked them to do, or lose all of their local government funding, all of it, not just the local, the law enforcement funding, all the local government funding from the state, which is a little bit the exact threat that Trump is making right now to our states and cities, right? Either you comply with what immigration, what our agenda, our deportation agenda, or you lose your funding.
And that, by the way, is legislation that's being presented by Evans and Hurd and Boebert, the Block Act.
And supported by the Mesa County Commissioners, I'll point out.
Correct, Jana.
So it's what I want you to take from this is not that there's no hope, but that this anti-immigrant movement, this restrictionist, supremacist movement, it has long roots. This guy, Stephen Miller, you're so familiar with now, he is, who's in Trump's cabinet, he is one of the architects of this group of bills that was being shopped around to states at the time. So they also made it, previous to this, the state house passed laws that made it impossible for people who are undocumented to get it at that time, a driver's license or an ID. It also made it so that people could not access any benefits that had state funding if they were undocumented. So at the time, the state was giving funding to clinics, health, sliding scale health clinics, and those clinics were forced to create like separate books, like state funded dollars could only go to people with status, and donations and private dollars were then kind of diverted towards people who were undocumented. And it put them in an uncomfortable position of having to ask people about their immigration status in order to serve them. And it created a lot of fear and a barrier for people to access that. It also made it so immigrants couldn't access professional licenses like to cut hair or be
Deb
a
has a
construction
question.
worker. Go ahead,
Deb?
Tom.
Yeah, along those lines, hospitals have always been required to treat whoever comes in the door. Were they under the same restriction in Colorado to not treat those of questionable citizenship status?
In an emergency situation, no. So they had to, federal law supersedes state law. So they had to still serve people. But I'm talking about clinics, you know, like I don't know, Tom, is there one on the western slope? Like here it would be Tepeyac.
Yeah, I mean, we have the Marillac Clinic, which is similar guidelines. They've changed recently.
Yeah. So those, so that's 2006. We have all these laws passed. We have a ton of fanfare about it. We also see the beginning of mass workplace raids. So this is when Immigration and Customs Enforcement targeted the Swift meat packing plant in Greeley. But there was also a raid later on in Fort Morgan at the dairy plant, at the Buckley Air Force Base. And we see these workplace raids start in 2006 and continue all the way through 2011. So, the state patrol were also deputized as immigration enforcement agents during this period under a 287G agreement. A lot of local county sheriffs also entered into those 287G agreements where they could stop you for anything and then question you about your immigration status. They would hold people for immigration to pick up as long as it took for immigration to get there. So we documented cases of people being detained, for example, in Jefferson County for 2 months after they had finished their sentence or bailed out because immigration hadn't come to pick them up, but they placed a hold on them. And so this made us per capita the state with the most people placed into deportation proceedings in 2009, when we saw 9,040 detainers. Those are those immigration holds saying like sheriffs cannot, are supposed to hold people until immigration gets there. 9,000 people were held in county jails until immigration showed up in 2009. The federal government expanded their contract with the for-profit detention center from 500 to 1,500 beds in that time period. And it was, I would love for you to talk, Tom, a little bit about what it meant for the agricultural sector, because I know for like 2 years in a row, the peach orchards were offering like $25 an hour to pick their crops and nobody came.
Yeah, and I think that there was tweaks to the H-2A program because they could not find local workers. There were some undocumented workers that would fly under the radar, but at that point, the H-2A visa program had not grown to the numbers we have today. So it was not something that growers were happy about. They resisted that as long as they could. And now they're, much to their chagrin, they're dependent upon the H-2A visa program. But in those years, it was the crisis that instigated the changes in policies that we have today.
Yeah, it was, and the community level cost of this, to most undocumented people live in mixed status families. So the cost of this many people being, placed into really expensive detention and deportation proceedings in Colorado was super high, both emotional and financial for people. Because the immigration court system doesn't have a public defender, a court-appointed attorney if you can't afford one. People who had been here a decade or more were selling their house, their car, taking out huge loans just to fight their detention and their deportation.
So I'll
So,
just say that we only have 10 minutes left.
yeah.
So
So what I think is interesting about this is in 2010, we sat down as a coalition, we looked at all of the laws that had passed. And we decided, you know what, we need to repeal all these laws. And to do that, we need to build a strategy and a campaign that really is statewide, that documents the analysis and the testimony and the experience of people who've been targeted by these systems and takes it into the Capitol. And that we create a situation that really shows how ICE does not respect the Constitution, how they're unaccountable and outside sort of the normal law enforcement approach to things. Not that that's perfect approach, but they're not even meeting that low bar. And be able to just credit them as an agency and show that we can actually do better and all thrive more and be safer if we can change these laws. So in 2012, we had our first convening of 100 leaders from across the state, most of whom were directly impacted. In 2012, we launched the hotline, which is the Colorado Rapid Response Network is an outgrowth of that hotline. Back in 2012, we started collecting hundreds of cases and training leaders across the state on how to meet with their sheriffs actually, and bring the sheriffs into understanding that there's a different way of thinking about community safety, and also to understand that the immigration system doesn't care that the person only was driving without a license. A lot of these sheriffs thought, oh yeah, they got arrested for that. I held them in my jail, but the immigration system will see they're not scary and just let them go. That's not how it works. Doesn't matter. Once you're in the deportation pipeline, you have to fight your case to the end with the judge in order to win. And the reason you were first stopped doesn't give anyone any discretion about what happens in your case. So when about a third of the sheriffs ended up joining us initially, and then the whole Sheriff's Association endorsed the repeal of SB 90. That repeal actually included a few Republican votes. So we passed all these terrible policies in a bipartisan fashion, and almost all of the pro-immigrant policies we have passed since then have had a handful of Republicans, mostly from rural areas and the mountains, join us, which I think is really important. I think sometimes we assume someone's from a certain party and that they're not going to get immigration issues, but a lot of the rural Republicans know immigrants, employ immigrants, and if they hear from their constituents, can sometimes be brave enough to break with their party on these issues. So we repeal all of the laws, and then we start passing protections in 2019, 2021, 2023, policies that actually make it unlawful to be colluding with ICE to subvert the Constitution. So that means in Colorado, no one should be held in a jail past their release date. It means no local law enforcement should be acting as immigration or asking people about their immigration status in any way, shape, or form. It means that they're not allowed to proactively share information with ICE, like call ICE and say like, oh, we think this person is undocumented or an immigrant. That's not allowed in Colorado. They can't share any information that isn't already available publicly. So we end up from 2007, from 1998 to 2013, it's all exclusionary laws. From 2014 to the present, we've passed more than 30 pro-immigrant bills and are now one of the most inclusive places in the country. And so this is the work that you all are so important for, is in like maintaining this defense and protection that we have built in this state over over like 2 decades, almost 3 decades. And I think it's really important to know that you're joining like a whole coalition of people, and how important it is. I was really glad to hear people are connected to HAP, to Hispanic Affairs Project, and to other groups that are have an immigrant base or run by immigrants, because those are the folks who have the best sense of where these policies are being violated, and can really bring that local impact and voice to a meeting with a legislator. And it really including those folks in any meetings you do get with county commissioners, with city councils, with your local legislators, and even your federal delegation is super important, for making a case that's not so theoretical. And for also hearing really directly from people, you know, what is most important, because when there are so many attacks coming down from the federal government, it can be hard to figure out what is most important to be saying and responding to. So that's
Yeah, the human voice is essential, and we know from past experience that it's functioned to change legislation, etc. And I think this is something that we should be working on the Western Slope. So that's one of the reasons that the May 15th pre-panel is hopefully going to attract the immigrant community as well as the Anglo community. We need to have that interaction. It's super important.
And then the last thing I'll say is just, I saw that there were a lot of questions about people's rights. So I want to be really clear, like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and specifically the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments cover everyone, no matter where you were born, what your immigration status is. We cannot control what ICE or the police or any law enforcement agency are going to do. And from my perspective, the point of utilizing your rights is to keep from yourself or someone else from incriminating themselves and giving away evidence that makes it more easy for immigration to be successful in deporting that person or detaining them. So they're not magic. It does, you know, using those phrases from Know Your Rights doesn't mean that the police or ICE are just going to be like, oh, you asked me if I had a warrant and I don't have one, so I guess I'll just leave. Like, no, like you really have to insist, you have to press, and it may be that even they don't have a warrant, they decide to enter a house. But if that's documented, there's the potential for any of that evidence to be thrown out. If someone's saying, I don't consent to this search, I'm not going to answer your questions, and we're documenting that, we're able to push back at the individual case level, it means a lot. There are a lot of noise that the Trump administration is making right now about, and real impacts from that noise of using the Alien Enemies Act to suspend the Constitution in certain instances, or attacking other due process rights. The courts are standing up to him. And I think the thing to watch, whether it's immigrant rights, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, the thing to watch as progressive movements that care about people's human and civil rights is when and if the administration ignores the court order. What is our plan? And I'm not asking you that in a rhetorical way. Like, that is our work right now. Each one of us, I think, across this country, locally, what does that response look like? Because the courts can only do so much. They can issue their orders, but if that order isn't followed, then it falls onto us as citizens to make it clear that we expect it to be followed. And it doesn't have to be a rally, it could be, but it could also be like really smart theater piece. It could also be, you know, a series of corner actions. It could be lots of different things, but it has to be something from every one of us, because that's when the constitutional crisis really deepens. But I want to say, like, the courts move slow. So what the president relies on is saying, I've decided this is not the law anymore, and then doing some stuff, then getting sued, then stopping. Then there's a long period where there's just an injunction until there's a decision and a court order. And that is the point at which we're gonna find out how long it will be before he stops listening to those orders. And the more loudly we're saying, these are the laws and the rules and the Constitution, they aren't being followed, we don't accept that, the slower all of that moves. And I do believe that the pushback on people being taken to El Salvador, the pushback, the disappeared, supposedly to El Salvador, although we don't know where most of them are, the pushback on the lack of due process in all of these cases and the profiling is slowing them down. So it is really important, even though it sometimes feels overwhelming. That was the other piece I wanted to answer before we close, because I think it's a real question. And I think for those of us who are white, it's very important to build a muscle, to build the muscle in the face of the overwhelm. Like Kristen was saying earlier, to just like lean into little pieces that we can do. Like find the thing we can do and keep doing it. Regardless of what the news and the administration is saying. And it is a muscle, like even myself doing this 20 years, this is a different context. And sometimes I find myself being like paralyzed in a way I haven't before. And like just finding ways to tap back into joy, to connection, and then to action. And not letting it lead us into isolation, despair, and inaction. Like that is the task for those of us who have citizen and white privilege, I think, in this moment.
The Wobblies filled the jails in all the municipalities that they landed in, and they shut down the system. Can we do that?
On my not taking off my paid employee of the American Friends Service Committee hat, you know, I've heard some people talking about what if all of us registered through this registry? Makes it kind of hard to find people then.
That's interesting.
Maybe, or shuts down the system. You know, they launched that tip line for ICE and it got so many calls asking them to deport Elon Musk that they shut it down. Now there's no tip line. I'm saying like no idea is too nuts. Like because some of the point is that these are ridiculous things that are happening, and being ridiculous in response is actually pretty effective in a lot of ways. In some instances. So let yourself be ridiculous, like really dream, you know, but make it be something ridiculous that your friends where you live would do it with you. You know, because what would work on the west side of Denver might not work in Grand Junction in the same way, you know.
We've discovered that.
What we're planning may or may
And
not
vice
work in,
versa.
may or may not work in Grand Junction, but we're going to do it anyway.
Yay.
We have a surprise planned for June 14th,
Excellent.
a different kind of street theater.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much to Jennifer Piper and Tom Acker. I think